The uninvited guest. Babysitting usually means a quiet night once the child is asleep. But this time, things took a different turn. I had just put the child to bed, carefully closing the door behind me. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I grabbed the remote and settled into the living room, ready to relax for the evening. It was a typical babysitting job, and I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But then, I heard it. A faint noise coming from down the hall. I paused, thinking it was just the house settling. But then it happened again, a soft thud followed by what sounded like shuffling. My mind immediately went to the child. Maybe they were up and playing in their room. I got up and walked down the hallway, my footsteps almost silent on the carpeted floor. I reached the child's room and slowly turned the doorknob. The room was dark, with just a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The child was fast asleep, undisturbed. I closed the door as quietly as I had opened it and stepped back into the hallway. That's when I noticed it. The back door was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I locked it earlier. A chill ran down my spine as I cautiously walked over and pushed it shut, making sure to lock it this time. I told myself it was nothing, just a draft, or maybe I hadn't closed it properly the first time. But the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. I returned to the living room trying to shake off the nerves, but as I sat down, something caught my eye. In the middle of the floor was an old toy, a small, weathered stuffed animal with faded fur and a single button eye. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The child had their toys in their room, and this one didn't belong to them. My heart started to race as I stood up, the toy's presence in the middle of the room feeling wrong, like an intrusion. I scanned the room, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe I had overlooked it earlier. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The noises started again, this time coming from the kitchen. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the kitchen, the noise stopped abruptly. I stood there, surrounded by the darkness and the eerie quiet. I could feel the tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I was no longer alone in my thoughts. There was something, or someone, else in the house with me. I thought about calling the parents or even the police, but something told me that whatever was happening, it was beyond their help. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. I kept my eyes on the back door, half expecting it to open on its own. But nothing happened. Eventually, the house returned to its unsettling silence, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak and shadow, but nothing more happened. When the parents finally returned, I didn't mention the strange occurrences. It felt too unreal to explain, too bizarre to share. As I left the house, I glanced back at the living room one last time. The toy was gone, as if it had never been there. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lingering in the house, stayed with me long after I had left. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. I've babysat for them a few times since then, but I've never seen that toy again or heard those noises. Still, I'm always on edge when I'm there, especially when the house gets too quiet. It's as if the house is waiting, biding its time for the next uninvited guest. The disappearing photos. One evening, I was babysitting in a quiet, well-kept suburban house. It was a typical job, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I thought. After the parents left, I did the usual routine, put the child to bed, tidied up a bit, and settled on the couch for a relaxing evening. The house was cozy, with warm lighting and family photos decorating the walls. As I glanced around, one of the photos caught my eye, a portrait of the family, smiling happily. I smiled back, appreciating the warmth it conveyed, but something about it seemed off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. After all, being alone in someone else's house can play tricks on your mind. I returned to my book, letting the hours slip by. A little while later, I passed by the photo again, and this time, I stopped in my tracks. The smiling faces I had seen earlier had changed. The father's smile was gone, replaced by a blank expression. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, sending a shiver down my spine. I took a step back, blinking, trying to convince myself that I was just tired. But as the night went on, the changes became impossible to ignore. Each time I walked by, a different face in the photos had shifted. Sometimes the expressions were blank, other times they seemed almost angry. Then, as I moved down the hallway, I noticed something even more disturbing. The people in the photos were starting to disappear. First, the mother's image faded until only a shadow remained, and then the child's picture grew dim, as if it were being erased. My heart raced as I continued down the hallway. With every step, another face vanished from the pictures. The once comforting photos of a happy family were now becoming empty, one by one, until only blank frames hung on the wall. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the house itself was watching me, mocking me with its silence. By the time the parents returned home, I was sitting in the living room, pale and shaken. They asked if everything was okay, and I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. I glanced back at the wall where the photos once hung, but to my shock, they were all back to normal. Smiling faces, no signs of anything amiss. I left that house as quickly as I could, and even though I've had many babysitting jobs since, that night has stuck with me. Every time I walk past a photo now, I can't help but glance twice, just to make sure nothing has changed. The mysterious basement babysitting is usually a pretty easy gig. The parents go out, the kids get tucked into bed, and the night is yours. That was exactly what I expected when I agreed to babysit for the Johnsons. Their house was in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, and the kids were sweet and well-behaved. It seemed like an easy way to make a little extra money on a Saturday night. Before they left, Mrs. Johnson gave me the usual tour: where to find the emergency contacts, the snacks, the remote control. But just as they were heading out the door, Mr. Johnson turned back and said, "Oh, and one last thing. Please don't go into the basement. It's off limits." He smiled, but there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. I nodded, brushing it off. What could be so special about a basement? Maybe it was just cluttered with old stuff, or they were doing renovations. I didn't think much of it as I settled onto the couch, flicking through channels on the TV. The first couple of hours were quiet. I checked on the kids a couple of times, but they were fast asleep. Everything was going smoothly until I heard a faint noise coming from somewhere below me. It was soft at first, almost like a scratching sound. I muted the TV and listened, but the noise stopped, so I shrugged it off. But then it came back, a little louder this time. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to focus on anything else. The noise had a strange rhythm to it, like someone dragging something across the floor. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, or maybe a rodent in the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a while, the noise stopped, and I started to relax again. But just as I was getting comfortable, there was a loud thud that seemed to come from right beneath me. My heart skipped a beat. I knew the basement was directly below the living room, and I suddenly remembered Mr. Johnson's warning. The idea of the off-limits basement started to feel more ominous. I told myself it was nothing, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving down there. I kept glancing at the basement door, trying to convince myself to stay put. But the noise wouldn't stop, and curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the basement door, hesitated for a moment, then slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase descending into the basement. I stood there, listening. The noise had stopped. For a moment, I thought about just closing the door and forgetting about it. But then I noticed something odd. There was a faint, musty smell drifting up from the basement like damp earth. Against my better judgment, I flipped on the light switch and started down the stairs. The basement was unfinished, with concrete floors and exposed beams, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air was thick with an uneasy energy. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something strange. Patches of fresh dirt scattered across the floor, like someone had recently dug up part of the basement. And then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, leading deeper into the shadows. My pulse quickened. The footprints looked fresh, too fresh, but there was no one there, just the quiet hum of the house. I took a few steps forward, following the trail, but the further I went, the more the unease grew. Finally, I stopped, realizing how far I had come from the stairs. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, shadowy space. I didn't need any more convincing. I bolted back up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. When the Johnsons came home, I didn't mention the basement. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I left, Mr. Johnson gave me that same smile, but this time it sent a shiver down my spine. I never babysat for them again, and I still wonder what was really down in that basement, or who.